The air at the neighborhood playground turned heavy in an instant when a deranged HOA, Karen, her eyes wide with rage and her hand trembling with misguided power, yanked a pistol from her purse and leveled it directly at the head of a little girl sitting helplessly in her wheelchair. Children's laughter snapped into screams, parents scattered in blind panic, and the world seemed to freeze as the metallic gleam of the weapon caught the midday sun, its barrel locking onto the child's frightened eyes. The girl's trembling fingers gripped the wheels of her chair as if she could somehow push herself away from the danger, while her friends burst into tears and dove behind swings and slides. Chaos spiraled as mothers shrieked, fathers lunged forward only to halt in paralyzing fear, and the entire park became a battlefield of horror. Yet in the center of it all, the girl sat frozen, too vulnerable to escape, staring at the woman who decided she didn't belong there. But what the unhinged Karen didn't know, what no one could have imagined, was that the child's father was not just another concerned parent. He was a Navy SEAL whose instincts, sharpened by years of combat, ignited like a storm inside his chest, every nerve screaming to strike, every muscle coiled to act. But held in place by the razor-thin line between timing and tragedy, his daughter's life balanced on the trigger pressure of a bitter woman's finger, and as the crowd's cries swelled, he inhaled once steady and controlled, his vision tunneling onto the threat, because he knew this wasn't just a mother's nightmare or a neighborhood dispute anymore. It was war, and the next heartbeat would decide who survived. Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe for more insane Karen stories. Life had always been a delicate balance of challenges and joy for our family, but we had carved out a rhythm that made every day feel like a victory. My daughter, born with a disability that left her confined to a wheelchair, never let her limitations define her spirit. She was sunshine wrapped in resilience, a child who smiled at the smallest things, whether it was the chirping of birds outside her window, the vibrant colors of flowers in bloom, or the laughter of her friends as they pushed her wheelchair faster down the gentle slope at the neighborhood park. That playground was more than just swings and slides for her. It was her sanctuary, a place where she felt equal, where her wheelchair wasn't a cage, but simply another set of wheels joining the fun. Every Saturday morning, she'd wake up with excitement sparkling in her eyes, urging me to get her there early so she wouldn't miss a single moment of play. The parents in our neighborhood, for the most part, adored her. They admired her courage, they loved her laughter, and they often told me she brought a special kind of light to the entire block. For me, as her father, nothing was more fulfilling than watching her integrate with the world around her, free from pity and full of belonging. My wife and I had worked hard to build this sense of normalcy, this bubble of peace where our daughter could thrive without fear or judgment. The HOA, in its countless absurd rules about grass length, mailbox colors, and parking lines, had always been a nuisance but never a true enemy. Neighbors bickered about fences and fees, but those disputes stayed petty. We never imagined that beneath the smiling faces and polite waves, bitterness and envy were quietly festering. To us, the community felt safe, predictable, even idyllic, and we believed nothing could shatter that illusion. What we didn't realize was that someone had been watching us with a heart filled not with acceptance, but with resentment. Resentment of our joy, of our daughter's unbreakable spirit, of the way people loved her. We thought the park was her fortress of freedom, but lurking in the shadows of that same playground was a storm waiting to strike, a storm named Karen. The first signs of trouble were subtle enough that most people would have brushed them aside as quirks of a bitter neighbor. But to me, they carried an undercurrent that felt heavier than simple annoyance, like the faint rumble before a storm that you can sense in your bones even when the skies still appear clear. Karen's first attack came dressed as an HOA complaint, a letter folded neatly into our mailbox with all the false professionalism that these notices usually wore, citing some obscure rule about our daughter's wheelchair ramp not meeting community aesthetic standards, as if the sight of her access to independence was an eyesore to be hidden, not a lifeline to her freedom. And though I crumpled that letter with steady hands, my chest burned with the insult that my little girl's needs could be treated like a violation of neighborhood decorum. Yet I told myself it wasn't worth escalating that it was just another HOA nitpick, and I threw it into the trash, but Karen didn't stop there. For soon she started showing up at the playground, arms crossed, lips pursed, lingering longer than any parent should when they weren't watching a child, and she made her presence known with cutting remarks disguised as casual observations, like "it must be dangerous having her around the swings," or "are you sure the space is safe for her?" Words that dripped with venom, even though her tone played at concern, and while other parents exchanged uneasy glances, no one confronted her directly because Karen had a way of making people feel cornered, like disagreeing with her meant painting a target on your own back. Over time, she began rallying whispers among neighbors, quietly suggesting that my daughter's presence posed risks to the other children, seeding paranoia where there had only been laughter, and though most families remained friendly, I noticed a few started to pull their kids away from the playground sooner when we arrived, their smiles tight, their excuses flimsy, their silence louder than words. Karen's manipulation was surgical. She didn't scream, didn't hurl open insults at first, but instead wrapped her cruelty in layers of HOA language and safety concerns, and she wielded that HOA handbook like a weapon sharper than any blade, threatening fines and rules whenever she felt her authority slipping. One day, she marched over to me while my daughter was playing and demanded, not asked, that we limit our visits to the playground because the HOA board would not be liable for accidents involving special needs equipment, a statement so absurd and cruel that I could feel my fists clench at my sides, yet I forced myself to stay calm because my Navy SEAL training had drilled into me the power of patience, of observing, of waiting for the right moment to act. And in that moment, I realized that Karen was not simply a nuisance, but a predator looking for weakness. I watched her escalate week after week from muttered complaints to direct confrontations, and when she saw that her words didn't chase us away, she grew bolder, shouting across the park about how unfair it was that HOA funds should go to maintaining ramps or accessible equipment, as if inclusion were theft, as if kindness were robbery, and with every insult, with every attempt to isolate us, she revealed more of the darkness she carried inside her. The other parents, uncomfortable and afraid of becoming her next target, stayed silent, their silence feeding her arrogance, and I could see the way she mistook their silence for support, her chest puffing up with the smugness of someone who believed she controlled the narrative. But I watched quietly, taking mental notes of her patterns, her manipulations, her lies, because I had lived through enemies who hid behind masks of authority before, and I knew that. The most dangerous foes were not those who screamed the loudest, but those who wormed their poison into the ears of the crowd. Still, what she failed to recognize was that her efforts, her petty schemes, and her weaponization of rules were lighting a fuse she could not control, a fuse that would eventually burn straight back to her own hands. Because I was no ordinary father who would bow to intimidation. I was a Navy SEAL, trained to spot threats long before they struck, trained to let an enemy reveal themselves fully before delivering the decisive blow. And as I pushed my daughter's wheelchair away from the playground one evening after Karen had hurled yet another insult about her being a disruption, I could feel the storm gathering on the horizon, knowing in my bones that these sparks of trouble were only the beginning of a fire that would soon consume everything Karen thought she controlled. It was supposed to be just another bright afternoon, the kind of day where the sun poured down warmth and laughter carried through the air like music, but peace has a cruel way of shattering without warning, and that day the playground transformed into a stage for terror when Karen, driven by whatever twisted cocktail of bitterness and rage fueled her, stormed onto the mulch with a face flushed red and a voice already cracking with fury, her words slicing through the joyful noise of children as she barked at parents about rules, safety, and nonsense that no one could even process before the true horror unfolded. Because in a blink she reached into her oversized purse, her hand closing around something cold and lethal, and when it came back up, the glint of a black pistol caught the sunlight and froze the entire park in a collective gasp. Mothers shrieked. Fathers jerked forward instinctively, then froze, and the sound of children's giggles twisted into piercing screams as Karen leveled that gun directly at my daughter, who sat frozen in her wheelchair near the swings, her wide eyes brimming with tears she didn't yet know how to process, her small chest heaving as if her very breath might be stolen away by the pull of that trigger. Everything inside me tightened like a coiled spring. The years of Navy SEAL training roaring alive in an instant as adrenaline coursed through my veins, slowing time to a razor's edge where every detail mattered, the trembling of Karen's hand, the way her finger hovered with dangerous twitching over the trigger, the faint whimpers of children scrambling behind the slide, the way the metal chains of the swings still rattled from the chaos of kids dropping them in panic. My instinct screamed to charge, to disarm, to neutralize, but I knew too well the fragile line between action and disaster, that one wrong move could set her finger in motion and end my little girl's life before my body could close the distance, so I forced myself to stay measured, controlled, though inside my heart hammered like thunder, and I could hear every shallow breath of my daughter as she sat frozen beneath the muzzle of madness. Karen's voice, shrill and venomous, cut through the silence as she spat words about liability, about ruining the neighborhood, about how special cases didn't belong here, each phrase dripping with hate so profound it stunned even the air around us, and yet no one dared move, no one dared speak, because in her hands was the authority of violence, the illusion of control, and for a fleeting moment it seemed she held power over life and death itself. Parents cowered behind benches, clutching their children, some sobbing, some whispering prayers, all paralyzed by the sight of a woman who had finally ripped away her mask of HOA pettiness and revealed the monster underneath. My daughter whimpered, barely audible, a small, broken sound that pierced me deeper than any wound I had ever suffered in combat, and my vision tunneled until the only thing I could see was her fragile body and the gun pointed at her head. Memories of battlefields flooded me, the chaos of ambushes, the split-second choices that decided who lived and who died. But none of those prepared me for the unbearable agony of watching my little girl be targeted like an enemy, and yet it was those same years of experience that taught me restraint, calculation, and the deadly patience of a sniper. I inhaled, slow and steady, my body falling into an old rhythm, scanning, measuring, waiting, because I knew Karen, for all her rage, was not trained, her stance sloppy, her grip unsure, her arm already shaking under the weight of the weapon she had no business holding, and that hesitation was my window, my only chance. I stepped forward just enough that her eyes flickered to me, her wild gaze locking onto mine as she sneered something about discipline and teaching a lesson, but beneath her words I saw the crack of fear, the fear of someone who had unleashed a storm she could no longer control. The air thickened, time stretched, and in that suspended heartbeat I knew the choice was no longer hers, it was mine, and as my body shifted into motion, swift and silent as it had done 100 times in the field, I prepared to do what I was born to do, not as a Navy SEAL, not as a soldier, but as a father whose only mission left in this world was to protect his child from the madness standing before her. The police finally arrived with sirens blaring and tires screeching, but what should have been a moment of rescue twisted almost immediately into a nightmare of disbelief, because instead of snapping the cuffs on Karen and whisking her away for threatening a child with a loaded weapon, the responding officers hesitated, their brows knitting not with outrage, but with caution, their first questions aimed not at the woman who had terrorized an entire playground, but at me, the father who had wrestled the gun from her grip and pinned her to the ground. In that surreal moment, my heart pounded with a fury sharper than any battlefield adrenaline, for while my daughter still trembled in her wheelchair, barely able to breathe through her sobs, I found myself having to explain every detail to men who seemed more concerned about understanding both sides than acknowledging the obvious. Karen had aimed a gun at a disabled child. Neighbors stepped forward as witnesses, their voices shaky, yet clear as they recounted the horror they had seen. But even then the officers murmured about procedure and temporary detainment, carefully avoiding words like arrest, as if the HOA board's influence or Karen's carefully crafted reputation as a longtime resident carried more weight than the cold steel weapon that had nearly taken an innocent life. I watched in disgust as Karen, now sitting upright with her hair disheveled, but her expression eerily composed, began spinning her web of lies, claiming I had lunged at her, that she had only brandished the gun in self-defense, and when she pointed at my Navy SEAL tattoos peeking from under my sleeves and hissed about how I intimidated her, I could see the officers exchanging looks, doubt flickering where certainty should have burned. Every second felt like betrayal, every cautious question like a knife in my back, and when one officer quietly suggested we all calm down and let the HOA mediate, I realized the system I had, risked my life to defend, was ready to side with bureaucracy over justice. Karen's HOA allies arrived within the hour, polished and calculating, already speaking of community misunderstandings and liability concerns, their language sterile but their intent clear: to protect their own and minimize scandal, even if it meant rewriting the truth in real time. My daughter, still clinging to my arm, whispered if Karen would come back to hurt her. A question that nearly broke me, as I promised, through clenched teeth, that I would never let that happen. But inside I burned with the knowledge that promises meant nothing if the law refused to honor them. As evening fell and the flashing lights faded, I stood on the same playground where only hours before joy had filled the air, now littered with caution tape and the echoes of chaos. And I understood with crystal clarity that we were alone in this fight, that the people sworn to protect us had chosen hesitation, that the HOA would bury the truth beneath paperwork, and that Karen, emboldened by even a sliver of doubt in the official report, would not disappear quietly, but would return sharper and more dangerous. Yet, as rage tightened around my heart, a colder resolve settled in my mind, the kind I had carried on covert missions where failure was not an option, because I knew that if the system would not protect my family, I would do so with a precision and patience that no HOA board, no careless police officer, and certainly no unhinged neighbor could ever outmaneuver. That night, after finally carrying my exhausted, tear-streaked daughter to bed and holding my wife until her trembling eased, I sat alone in the dim light of my study and let every detail of the day burn itself into memory, because this was no longer about HOA rules or neighborly disputes. This was war, and wars are not won by outrage but by strategy. Years of Navy SEAL operations had carved into me a discipline of patience and precision, and now those same skills, once used to neutralize threats on distant shores, would serve to defend my family at home. So I began to plan with the calm focus of a mission commander. I started by gathering evidence with military efficiency. Every text message Karen had ever sent about liability, every HOA notice she had authored, every neighbor's statement captured on video before fear could change their minds, and every photo of the gun she had aimed at my child. I mapped the playground from memory, like an operational zone, marking where each witness had stood, reconstructing angles, distances, and timelines until the chaos of the incident became a precise diagram of proof. But I knew paper trails alone wouldn't corner someone like Karen, because she thrived on twisting words and exploiting hesitation. So I set the next layer of my plan in motion, leveraging contacts from my military career who had transitioned into law enforcement, legal work, and private investigation, men and women who understood both the value of airtight evidence and the art of quiet preparation. One trusted friend, now a federal prosecutor, guided me on how to present the case directly to a district attorney and bypass the local HOA-friendly precinct, while another, a cybersecurity expert, helped me legally retrieve and preserve digital records Karen thought she had deleted. I also began documenting every interaction with her going forward, wearing a discreet body camera, and instructing my family to keep phones recording whenever she appeared, ensuring that the next time she tried to rewrite reality, we would have an unshakable archive of the truth. But my plan wasn't only defensive. SEAL training had taught me the power of psychological pressure, of shaping an environment until the adversary's own choices became their trap. So I subtly shifted our routine, arriving at the playground with calm regularity and an unmistakable air of vigilance, making sure Karen saw that fear had no place in our home, and when she tried to provoke, I offered nothing but silence and an unblinking stare that reminded her, wordlessly, that I had faced far deadlier foes. Behind the scenes, I filed for a restraining order with supporting affidavits from multiple witnesses and initiated a civil suit for emotional distress and endangerment, actions that required meticulous paperwork but carried the weight of law that even an HOA could not bury. I reached out quietly to sympathetic neighbors, sharing the full truth of what had happened, something Karen had counted on them never hearing in full, and watched as their discomfort turned to outrage, their once muted voices promising to testify, if needed, stripping Karen of the silent majority she had manipulated for years. And because I understood that predators often double down when cornered, I fortified my home with security cameras linked to a private monitoring service, ensuring that if she attempted retaliation, there would be immediate, indisputable evidence. Each step of this plan unfolded not with rash emotion, but with the measured patience of a soldier setting a calculated ambush. And as days passed without a single misstep, I could sense the balance of power shifting, the HOA board growing nervous as subpoenas loomed, Karen's once confident posture shrinking each time she saw the calm readiness in my eyes, the quiet alliances forming among neighbors who now understood they had been living under her intimidation all along. Through it all, my daughter slowly regained the courage to return to the playground, her small victories, one more lap around the swings, one longer burst of laughter, fueling my resolve to finish what I had started. Because this wasn't vengeance for its own sake, it was protection carried to its logical conclusion. Using every ounce of my training, every contact earned in years of service, and every legal avenue available to make sure that Karen's next move, no matter how small, would be the one that delivered her directly into the consequences she had so long evaded. The moment the first piece of damning footage hit the inboxes of the HOA board, the tone of the neighborhood shifted from cautious murmurs to a low, roaring panic that swallowed Karen whole. Because cameras don't lie, and the loop of her hand raising the pistol, of her finger twitching on the trigger while a child's face froze in terror, played again and again in living rooms and on phones until her carefully constructed persona cracked like old paint under pressure. I watched her change from the queen bee of petty rules into a woman whose confidence leaked away with every replay, her cheeks flushing not with indignation but with a dawning, raw fear as neighbors who had once nodded politely at her now crossed the street to avoid her gaze, or, in a handful of brave cases, marched up to my door to volunteer sworn statements, their earlier silence melting into righteous anger because seeing the truth restored their moral compass. The HOA board, cornered and furious at being exposed for, covering thin excuses, convened emergency meetings where their polished committee members argued and bickered over damage control, and when subpoenas from the district attorney landed on Karen's doorstep, the air around her tenancy changed from entitlement to vulnerability, the same entitlement that had allowed her cruelty suddenly transforming into the smallest, most human expression of regret, one that rang false to all who knew what they'd seen on the footage. Karen tried to retaliate in the ways she knew best, filing counter-complaints about noise and alleging harassment, whispering to the press about being set up, and even attempting to smear my reputation by spreading half-truths about my military past, but every claim was met with more evidence. Time-stamped videos, audio clips of her threats, and testimonies from parents whose guilt had turned to courage. The county prosecutor, aided by a clear chain of custody of digital proof my cybersecurity friend had preserved, moved faster than the HOA had ever imagined possible. And within weeks, Karen found herself answering to charges that were not about bylaws, but about endangerment, reckless use of a firearm, and making terroristic threats. Labels that stripped her of the veneer of respectability and left her scrambling to retain a foothold in a community that now recoiled at her presence. Her legal team, expensive and polished, attempted to negotiate. Promises of quiet settlements, offers to move away, pleas, for privacy. But the community refused to let the matter be buried. Parents who had once stayed silent now rallied, their collective voices louder than any HOA memo could be, and on the day Karen arrived at a packed hearing, the faces in the room were not just those of strangers, but of people she had toyed with and bruised, their expressions a ledger of moral repayment. When the judge reviewed the unedited footage and the corroborating witness statements, the restraining order that had once felt like a distant legal theory materialized into hard, enforced reality. Karen was stripped of firearm privileges, ordered to surrender any weapons, and legally barred from approaching our home and the playground. A paper boundary backed now by the threat of arrest, and watching her shoulders slump as the bailiff read the terms felt like seeing a caged animal finally submit. But the downfall wasn't only legal. Her social world imploded in quieter, more painful ways. Neighbors who had hosted her for book club nights returned invitations as if they'd never known her. Children who once waved now averted their eyes, and local businesses that had once smiled at her face in the store suddenly refused her service. A social enforcement more devastating to her pride than any legal penalty. Enraged and unmoored, Karen lashed out in small, vindictive acts, smearing paint on our mailbox in the dead of night, filing baseless harassment suits, making anonymous calls. But each act only dug her deeper because we had prepared. Motion activated cameras recorded everything, neighbors documented patterns of retaliation, and each petty attack became another line item in the files the prosecutor would later use to show that her aggression was not an isolated incident, but a pattern of escalating danger. As the weeks turned into months, her legal options dwindled, and the HOA moved to expel her from the community on grounds of repeated endangerment and violation of bylaws meant to protect residents, a bureaucratic hammer that finally matched the weight of moral outrage. And on the day the board's decision went into effect, a small crowd gathered not to gloat, but to watch justice unfold. To feel the relief that comes when a threat is removed from a neighborhood's fabric. In the quiet aftermath, with Karen relocated and the court case pending, but the immediate danger neutralized, the playground slowly reclaimed its laughter. My daughter hesitated the first few times she returned, as any child would after trauma, but with each visit her grin returned a little more, like a sunrise pushing stubborn fog aside. For me, the victory tasted of something more complicated than triumph. There was sorrow for a neighbor who had become so consumed by hate that she flailed herself into ruin, and there was a solemn satisfaction that meticulous preparation, legal strategy, and community courage had protected the most precious thing I owned. As the neighborhood rebuilt trust, I remained vigilant, but changed, not hardened, but sharpened by the lesson that sometimes protection requires strategy, that systems can fail, and that when they do, ordinary people can become extraordinary by standing together, documenting truth, and refusing to let fear dictate who gets to belong in the places we call safe. Months later, the neighborhood felt transformed, not just in the quiet of freshly cut lawns or the laughter of children reclaiming the playground, but in the way people greeted one another with a new depth of solidarity, as if the entire community had survived the test together and passed with hard-won wisdom. My daughter, once wary and withdrawn after the attack, rolled toward the swings with her trademark fearless grin again, her courage slowly rewoven through countless small victories. A full lap around the merry-go-round without a glance over her shoulder, a triumphant squeal on the slide that made nearby parents clap with tears in their eyes. Watching her reclaim her joy was the purest reward, because every sleepless night of planning, every affidavit and court appearance, every ounce of restraint in those first terrifying moments had been for this, the right for her to laugh without fear. Neighbors who once stayed silent now made a point of saying hello, organizing weekend barbecues, and promising to keep watch for each other. The HOA board, humbled and reshaped by what had happened, rewrote its own charter to prioritize safety, inclusion, and the voices of every resident, ensuring no single person could ever twist its rules into a weapon again. Even the local police, stung by public criticism for their hesitation, began new community safety programs that bore the fingerprints of the case we had endured. For me, the journey left a different imprint. It reminded me that true strength isn't only in precise action or military training, but in unrelenting love, the kind that stays calm under fire, gathers allies quietly, and never gives up on justice no matter how long it takes. On the day the court finally announced Karen's permanent restraining order and a lengthy probation that barred her from owning a firearm, my daughter and I returned to the playground together. The air felt lighter, the sky sharper, and when she spun her wheelchair in a joyous circle, her laughter rising like music, I knew we had turned the darkest chapter of our lives into proof that families can win against fear. If you believe in standing strong for your loved ones, smash that subscribe button right now and share the story with someone who needs hope today. Comment where you're watching from and tell me, What would you have done if someone like Karen threatened your family? Your voice could inspire someone else to find their courage, and together we can make sure stories like this spread light instead of fear.